Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you are having an amazing day. We have lots of news to get through in this video, but I want to start things out with a small piece of good news if you're thinking of putting together a budget AMD rig, and that is a refresh of sorts of the Ryzen 3 1200. You may recall that late last year there were reports that the Ryzen 1600 was now essentially a 2600 but basically just rebadged, and of course it was known as the 1600AF. Well, according to German publication / website Computerbase, much the same is now happening with the Ryzen 3 1200. It is essentially the same specification wise, so for example, still 4 cores, 4 threads, still the same clock frequencies, and we have no changes of course in cache. Predominantly the big change here is the fact that it is a different architecture. It's not Zen 2 unfortunately, instead AMD have opted to use Zen 3, and as for price it's going to cost you around $60 US. Obviously it is only a quad-core processor without SMT support, so hardcore gaming equal probably no, but if you're looking to put together a budget rig, streaming system, that type of thing, then it's certainly a viable option. Then again, AMD do have a number of different APUs which are on the market as well, and as I covered quite recently, there are a couple of other AMD processors rumoured to be in the works, including the 3300X, which is quite honestly looking to be extremely interesting given the supposed price of around $100. Ultimately though, this is just good for us in terms of more competition in the market, and speaking of competition in the market, let's move over to some Intel news and the 10th generation processors. This is from a variety of different sources, including Term APISAC and Notebook Check, so we'll of course link their respective links in the video description. That was a bit of a crappy sentence, but whatever. And we have the 10700K, 10600K, and a couple of other processors which have had their results leaked online, although I would stress that these are only Geekbench results, which are obviously not indicative of every single workload in the history of humanity. Ultimately, the 10700K can essentially be thought of as a slightly tweaked version of the 9900K. It still has 8 cores, 16 threads, but the clock frequency is a little different. For example, we have 5100 MHz on single core speed, 4700 MHz on all core, and the 10600K is a slightly faster version of the 8700K. So if you have an 8700K that's overclocked, you will basically get the same result here. I won't go through all of the different benchmarks because I will be here until Christmas, but the single core score of the 10900KF is 6287 points, which is slightly ahead of the 6,000-ish points of the 10700K, and the 10600K scores 6081. How does this compare though? How does it stack up against AMD's lineup? Well, in the single core score, the 3700X scores around 5700 points, and you can basically get identical scores, single core results anyway, with the 3600. As for multi-thread, well, obviously things are a little bit different, and AMD's 3700X will slightly lose or be about on par to the 10700K. And I do mean about, so we are looking at variances which will depend on per benchmark run, and of course different configurations like memory timings, memory speeds, blah 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 will probably make all the difference in the world. Hell, if you're running with like a web browser open, you could probably account for the difference in score between, let's say, the 3700 and the 10700K. The only negative really of Intel's processors, well, there's a couple. The first is that they are releasing rather late. We all know about the kind of time frame that we're looking at, and the problem is, in best case, Intel only have 4, 5, 6 months. That is even if AMD's processors for the Zen 3 architecture are significantly delayed and they do not release this year. Let's say they do release next year. That's very unlikely, but let's just say worst case scenario that does happen. It's not really that long that Intel would have kind of the run of the place. The other issue is that there's always those rumours as well that Rocket Lake doesn't release that much later than what we see Comet Lake. No matter what the architecture of Rocket Lake ends up being, we do know it is an upgrade from the Skylake architecture. And essentially this means that Comet Lake could have a quite short shelf life. It could be in 6, 9, well, maybe not 6, but certainly 9 or 12 months, Intel releases a new processor, which would obviously also benefit with features like PCIe 4. And the final negative, and this is for many people probably the biggest, is that these things are supposedly rather power hungry in comparison to what AMD put out. Then again, I am happy that Intel are at least releasing this. I know some people aren't particularly enamoured by the prospect of Comet Lake, but I also do know some people who want to buy it. And if they are only intending to buy for gaming or applications which really do benefit from higher clock frequencies, then you know what, all power to you. And I know some people I speak to, because I do kind of DM with a lot of you guys on Twitter and also Facebook, and yeah, just I know some people kind of want to build the system just because of fun. And I think that Intel's 10th generation is going to be kind of interesting for gamers, but it's mostly the power efficiency is going to be the problem, I think, for their upcoming platform. And we are going to now mosey, yes, doing some moseying, to a piece of news for, well, SSDs of the next generation consoles. Credit to Video Games Chronicle. Wow, I really can't speak today. It's because I've been doing bloody video editing all day. And they have stated that developing for the next generation consoles is, well, making the old ones feel rather crappy in comparison. Much of this article was focused on the PlayStation 5's SSD, but I think a lot of this would also, of course, be applicable with the Xbox as well. According to Marcus Leto, who is a former Bungie art director, he claims that it will make a huge difference, obviously in reference to the SSD. It will open up a door for more expansive content that can stream a lot faster. Players won't have to have loading screens, and we won't have to hide things behind cinematics and that kind of thing. And it will just make things a lot more seamless and fluid for the gamers. And I'm really excited about that because it's one of those things that's really hard for us, particularly right now, dealing with old platforms. Those the platforms have been around for, what, 7 years? And developing for them is like machinery in the Stone Age. Indeed, he also said that the previous generation, he thinks it's one of the benefits of having the game industry so long is it's kind of second nature to build environments with some boundaries around it, and understanding memory limits, draw distances, shader overdraw. It just becomes second nature. I personally am really excited just for the SSD technology of the next generation consoles. I've said this several times. One thing that does concern me about the PlayStation's SSD is I still don't like the wishy-washy language that they've been using in terms of the storage upgrades of the console. Obviously, yes, the Xbox's SSD is slower, but I feel more confident at the moment that it's going to be really easy to kind of upgrade the SSD, so I'll be really paying attention to how all of that pans out with the official announcements. Obviously, things are still really up in the air when it comes to the SSD prices as well, which is kind of concerning to me because, well, if you take a look at the prices of even like a modestly sized SSD for the PC, especially the faster ones like PCIe Gen 4, they are not cheap. So I get the feeling people's eyes are going to be watering when they're purchasing the storage for the next console. So that's going to be really interesting to see what people end up doing. One benefit of at least the older games for the Xbox, I assume it's going to be similar for the PlayStation as well, for backwards compatibility, is you can store backwards compatible games. So for example, Xbox One, of course, on a external drive, much like you do with the Xbox One at the moment. So that's kind of good. But I'll be very curious to see what the prices end up being for the Xbox's kind of cartridge-based solution. And I'll also be very curious to see what Sony does in terms of verifying that an SSD can work with their respective console. I know much of the focus at the moment is on things like, the GPU of the systems, but quite honestly, I am really interested in the next generation consoles purely for the SSDs. Like, even if they did not have the insane read and write speeds that the consoles have ended up with, even if it was like an eighth of that, I think it would have been really interesting to see what developers have been having to hold back. And it's kind of like it's just been a major constraint for them, because obviously at the end of the day, if you can't get data into memory, it doesn't matter how fast the consoles have been. And obviously with the mid-cycle refresh that we had with the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X, that hindrance was still there. They obviously still had those slower drives, so I feel that the mid-gen refresh was kind of held back by that. So I'm going to be really curious just what developers are able to kind of achieve without needing to concern themselves with I/O. And now we're going to move over to another piece of console news, and this is from Daniel Ahmed, who is Nico Partners analyst. And he believes that now that E3 is cancelled because of world events, cough, 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 you know what I'm talking about, he thinks that events will kind of be shifted around naturally. And some of this may mean that some stuff is actually earlier than what you would see with E3, but some of it could be a bit later. The problem is, so much stuff is in the air. I think at this point it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that May, June, July, we will see an awful lot of reveals from all of the consoles. I personally believe that we're going to see some drip feeding. Microsoft is allegedly going to have 2 conferences. That's what the rumours are, with one in 1 month, and then the next month after that we're going to see the next conference. But while some people have reported on that, like Windows Central, who usually have pretty damn good sources, said that this is true, and they definitely know that stuff is going to be revealed concerning the next generation consoles at these conferences. The problem is they don't know exactly what will be revealed. So, for example, you could have this thing of maybe a couple of gameplay demos and maybe a couple of other cool things for the system, but maybe they will wait the next month to kind of reveal the prices and maybe some additional exclusives for the Xbox. That's just an example, and much the same could be said, of course, for Sony. Indeed, in many ways, Sony are a little bit behind Microsoft on the reveal. I've said this like a trillion times before, but I really don't exactly like the way Sony have handled the reveal of the PS5, particularly at the moment. I believe that Road to PS5 was a real mistake for them to kind of air it the way they did. And I know that they did kind of state it's for developers, but they also pushed it very publicly as well and stated essentially this is where you're going to learn about the PlayStation 5. And obviously lots of details weren't even really mentioned about the system anyway. There was a crap ton of technical questions that we still had. And I don't even mean like kind of more in-depth ones. I just mean like basic stuff, and Microsoft have been a lot more aggressive confirming officially features. But for now anyway, Sony are kind of I'm just going to be really interested to see how they handle this. And furthermore, I would also be curious to see what Microsoft ends up doing with Lockhart. Lockhart is going to be definitely the interesting one, especially given we've seen prices, obviously, of the Xbox One X kind of crash at the moment. Rumour is that Sony are obviously going to have to crank the prices up of their console. It looks like much the same for the Xbox as well, simply because of production costs for the system. It's not the ability to manufacture the hardware, that's not the problem, it's the creeping price of the actual hardware itself, how much it's costing them for the actual components. For me, I'm also very curious, and I wonder what you all think, of what the hell Nintendo are going to do with the Switch. Clearly, we've heard so many rumours about a Switch Pro, and some type of announcement, a dual-screen Switch, which you would assume would have some type of beefed-up hardware, and one of the really cool things about the Switch at the moment is that you can take experiences on the go. I'll grant you that Doom or what have you is not ideal to play on a Switch, but at least you can do it. And so that ability to play AAA experiences on the go is definitely a major positive for the system. And it does make me curious to see if Nintendo will eventually either release entirely new hardware, or indeed will crank out a Switch Pro. Indeed, on the subject of the Switch, many of you may know that Nintendo's manufacturing supply chain has received a bit of a kick in the shin. There's been shortages, therefore, of actual Switches in retail stores, and this has meant that there has been some price gouging. Indeed, if you look at eBay right now, you can, for a used Switch, be paying more than what you could have bought a new Switch for just several months ago, which is absolutely nuts. But apparently Nintendo anyway is somehow hoping to pull out a miracle, and they want to actually boost the number of Switches that are produced this year, 2020. So they are hoping to produce around 22 million Switches this year, and this is a report from Nikkei Asia. As of the December period of last year, the Switch had been absolutely dominating sales. It's hit just over 50 million. So imagine if they do manage to achieve this figure. It's hard to believe that they wouldn't hit at least 70-75 million Switches by the end of 2020 unless things go extremely wrong. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it enjoyable, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.